Now, this is coming at the end of a project that's now been running, a network that's been running for 2 years. And really what we're doing here is drawing together a variety of things we've seen over the 2 years, where we're exploring what might think of as a contention or a hypothesis about how academics could engage with a class of really wicked problems that matter to decision makers of one sort and another. And by what we've done, we've learned a whole variety of things. And to get the meeting going, both David and Lenny are going to present various things about what we've seen and what we've heard from people we've talked to, the pilot projects we've had, and our investigations into the literature. They're setting off 2 days of work where we'll draw it together at the end where we think it leads to and what really ought to follow. Anyway, let me hand over to David and get him to get us on the road.
So, first of all, thank you very much for coming so early in the morning. And as David says, we're going to start off with a sort of setting the scene, and then we're going to hear from the people that we funded to do pilot projects, and actually one person that was funded by the other network also, which is nice, and with some other papers, and hope to have a good discussion. So, these are some of the people who were part of the network at a number of meetings we held, small meetings, discussing what people thought was meant by uncertainty, discussing various problems. And you see there are people ranging there from Jim Berger, who's a very well-known statistician, to psychologists like Gert Gigerenzer and David Good, policymakers like Gus O'Donnell, Mervyn King, and Patrick Destremaux, who was at the time the Deputy Chief of the French Armed Forces. So we had people who knew about taking decisions and were interested in the topic. The two real questions. The first one, that what we were asked to do was to look at real-world decision-making. So how is real-world decision-making under uncertainty actually being addressed by the research community in the UK and beyond the UK as well? Second, what might be the potential for new world-leading research and innovation? So this is what I'm going to try and say something about. And part of the point of this would be to hear from you places where you think we've missed things out, we haven't got it quite right, and so on, because we want the document that's currently in a draft form to be improved by your presence here. So what does research to date say about real-world decision-making, about what real-world decision-makers have to decide and how it might be improved? Well, our approach to this is to start with the real-world decisions. So there were a list of decisions that the Research Council has actually put into the original call, which we've kind of added to, but they're all essentially the same kind of thing, from the experiences we've had talking to people. So, for example, should you expand your company into a new product or new technology? How should you prepare for as yet unforeseen cybersecurity threats? What significant infrastructure should be built in the UK? At the moment, and you'll hear about it tomorrow morning, the UK Cabinet Office is trying to decide on what the priorities should be, and this is quite a big topic. What to do to alleviate the impact of climate change? What level of research, training and innovation spending to choose for maximum benefit of the UK economy? So in fact, the Prime Minister set up last week a commission to look exactly at this under the chairmanship of Andy Haldane, who's one of the people who's also been helping us. How to change the planning system to increase affordable housing. Which investments to prioritise in the health service. How to mitigate humanitarian crises, and when to restrict growth in credit to protect financial stability. This would be the big question prior to the financial crisis. So these are the kinds of questions which we are looking to see what do academics contribute to this kind of thing at the moment. And clearly you can see from the what levels of immigration to allow. And you can see that challenges of this type clearly require ideas and expert knowledge from multiple disciplines. So one of the themes that's going to be an issue is, what is an expert What do experts contribute? Which experts do you call in when? And what happens if they disagree? These are really fundamental questions for real-life decision makers. Now, also, the point about all these decisions is they have what we call radically uncertain features. So what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that decision makers themselves know, that it's impossible to imagine all choices or to calculate all the significant possible outcomes of the one selected. They know also that their decisions have complex and interacting consequences that are hard to foresee. Just if you think of a piece of financial regulation, as soon as you've done it, the system adapts, all kinds of things come, and you can't possibly anticipate all things. So how do you deal with that sort of situation? Moreover, because the decisions will have a big effect on the future well-being of their companies, society, and the overall economy, they're also what we think of as high-impact decisions, and eventually they have high visibility. So you have the problem also of being in some way seen to have made the decision, and what does that do to the whole situation? And in less technical language, as Lenny already said, people sometimes call these wicked problems because they know that they're hard to solve. Now, terms like risk, ambiguity, and uncertainty, this is one of our main findings, which may seem trivial, are actually used very differently in different disciplines. Very differently in the natural sciences, for example, than in the social sciences. Economists, of course, make their distinction between risk and uncertainty, and then essentially build their models with risk in the way they do it. But that particular distinction is not actually necessarily followed. So one of the interesting things is that in psychology, where there's a lot of study of decision making, there are virtually no papers. I mean, they call it uncertainty, but it's just, in fact, unclear quite what they mean, because then immediately there is a correct decision, which is a little bit hard to think. What is a correct decision if you're dealing with radical uncertainty? There might be a sensible decision on the time, but is it correct or not is really a different question. So we call uncertainty radical because decisions like the ones I listed are often novel. The key point being that therefore the question is whether existing knowledge and data is relevant. That's the point, that you don't really know what bits of what you know are going to be relevant for the future. To decide what to do will require imagination and judgment about what we think we know, particularly as the speed of change today in a dynamic and complex world means that while we cannot be sure exactly what will happen, we can be pretty sure that, so to speak, unexpected stuff happens. And that's definitely the case if you find yourself in the cabinet or in the cabinet office or somewhere like that. Think of the discovery of metal fatigue in jet airliners. It's slightly close to my heart because my father would have been on the Comet airliner, the one after it crashed. And you may or may not be aware that at the time of the Comet airliner, the British aerospace industry was well ahead of everybody else in developing a jet airliner, but nobody knew about metal fatigue or the necessary shape of windows, so the thing crashed, and it took a long time before they addressed that problem. It simply hadn't been thought of. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for most of my adult lifetime, and childhood, was not imagined to be happening anytime soon. The global financial crisis, 9/11, climate change, and then things like smartphones. I mean, I was doing an interview study of fund managers in 2007, January 2007, sitting in New York, and this guy was talking to me about how he'd just made an investment in Apple. Now, you probably don't remember, but at the time, Apple shares were going down quite quickly. In fact, Microsoft actually bought shares in Apple in order to prevent Apple going under, and then they were worried they were going to be a monopoly and face antitrust legislation. But this chap started talking about a thing called the iPhone, which was just hitting the streets of New York. Now, think of the iPhones or smartphones that you have in your pocket and all the different implications, including social media and all the rest of it that have come. So this is one of the reasons why, for big decisions, you're looking at, you have to take account of things that haven't come. And I've also recently been going around with the Bank of England's agents, they go around talking to businesses to try and understand what's going on in the economy. And the amazing thing, if you go and actually talk to businessmen, is they are constantly, that's the point, they're looking for new things to do. They're looking for new ways of putting things together. They're worrying what their competitors are doing that is new. And of course, at the moment, they're worrying about what Brexit is going to produce that is new. And so all the time, in this type of real-world decision-making environment, the issue is, what do you know? And what of what you know is actually going to be useful. And of course, on the whole, it's not clear that any kind of mathematical analysis and modeling can be applied to these situations, although it may be applied to some of the underlying issues you're trying to examine. So what do we know and I'm finding out about this kind of situation? So to examine the current landscape of academic research related to real-world decision under radical uncertainty, we make a very important distinction. That is, a distinction between research that looks at what you might call optimal choice outcomes. That is, it uses mostly mathematical optimization techniques to discover what it is best to choose in a given situation. Now, this is often given the name of rational choice. So certainly in economics, when they talk about rational choice and rational expectations, they mean optimization under the constraints available. The second kind of research you can imagine is research on the process of actual decision-making. That is, into the process of making choices, for example, how you use models you may have, using historical research, observational, interviewing, and experimental paradigms. What we find is that much research using an optimal choice framework, there is a lot of research of that type, but comparatively little which examines decision process in real-world context under radical uncertainty. And interestingly enough, almost no research on the use of optimal choice frameworks in actual practice. This is rather surprising because a feature of the challenges I listed above is that in all cases, there will not be sufficient information, much less to define, much less to identify what an optimal choice might be. Think of the things I gave you. So what has been the supply of research? Well, David Good, sitting in front of me, kindly has done a literature search, and in the Web of Science, you will see that there are 23,000 articles published in the last 5 years. It's a lot of articles with the words uncertainty and decision both present. Of these, 2,860 had at least one UK-based author. And among the articles, 230 focused in some way on policy. So there's already a small number. In those, 17% of the researchers were UK funded by EPSRC. In the 17% of researchers who were UK funded, 7.5% were funded by EPRC, and then you see the others there, and going down to lots of other organisations. Now, we looked at the abstracts of the 230 articles, and most of them explore an optimal choice, try to find out what would be the optimal thing to do in the particular situation they're discussing. 20 articles, that's 1%, addressed broader topics such as hostage negotiation, back and front stage policy making in local government, ways of listening to the public, etc., etc., etc. So the amount that we're actually looking at this kind of thing was very small. Now this of course is a literature search, it's subject to possible biases and so on, but I think the overall picture is fairly clear. So while most articles made the case for what choices should be made, less than 1% directly addressed the decision-making process in which OCF solutions might be proposed, understood, and used. And we also examined abstract from the 50 highest cited articles with uncertainty, decision and policy, and you get much the same sort of finding. Now, very few articles, 111, use the term knight in uncertainty or radical uncertainty. Well, radical uncertainty is not necessarily a particularly well-used term, so that may not be that surprising. Knight in uncertainty, on the other hand, is very commonly used, but the basic point is that most of it doesn't really make that particular distinction. So considered from a real-world decision-maker point of view, you might think that the academic research literature offers academically framed information about ways of making optimal choices in different areas. But it doesn't really tell you much about the problems you might have in making decisions or in where you might go wrong or how you could go right and things of that kind. Failing to frame problems within a radically uncertain context, whatever the nomenclature, makes it likely that there is a significant possibility also of well-meaning misapplications of risk modelling. For example, in finance, it's one of the criticisms of what happened before the global crisis, because if you apply risk modelling to what are in fact uncertainty problems, you get issues. And there's the famous case of the risk officer of Goldman Sachs standing outside Goldman Sachs in 2007 and saying they'd suffered two events which actually you would not have more or less been on the planet long enough to happen in a week. Right? So you get people who clearly understand very well statistics, but end up applying them in a way that makes no sense and breaks the rules. Now that we've discovered there are centres of excellence where OCF approaches are listed, and Peter and his network has also listed some, and there are some others there. But basically, we find no well-funded centre focused on cross-disciplinary, practitioner-sensitive, real-world decision-making under radical uncertainty. And so this is, we think, is a gap. Now, one of the ways you can look at how this came about is looking at research into decision-making as opposed to optimal choice. Because it's quite interesting that the earliest modern research into the processes through which business and government reach decisions were conducted by organisation and management theorists, mostly just after the Second World War. And this was a nascent field, was definitely cross-disciplinary, used sociology, psychology and economics to recognise that a major challenge for organisational decision makers was how to manage and overcome precisely the lack of knowledge about the future evolution of plans that we've called radical uncertainty. So the classic stuff, actually it was the stuff I was made to read way back in the late 60s in Cambridge in an economics course, but I don't think you'd get it now, was from Herbert Simon, Satt and Marsh, Burns and Stalker and so on, who were mainly looking at how do people cope with the fact they don't know what's going to happen. And this built up and became the sort of basis of management research. And scholars from this tradition examine characteristics of the environment, informal and informal structures, the consequence of the separation of ownership and control, company narratives, cognitive processes, behavioural response repertoires, and social expectations. And there was also a developing interest at the time in how decisions were influenced by group and cognitive affective processes, most famously Janis's study of the Cuba in the American invasion of Cuba that went wrong, the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which they talked about groupthink and how the people making the decision had got sort of stuck in their own way of thinking. And then Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance, which interestingly enough is enjoying a revival, though not particularly in psychology. It's enjoying a revival in sort of places like the Financial Times. You'll find people talking about cognitive dissonance. So research in this tradition, of course, was generally not mathematical, but observational, descriptive, and interpretive, with historical case studies playing a major role. But in the 1970s, everything began to change, and it's rather clear if you look at the literature. So it started with the introduction of applied mathematics in operation research and economics, game theory, expected utility theory, Nash equilibrium, subjective utility, and so on. And particularly under the influence of economics, particularly Milton Friedman and Gary Becker, research moved from studying real-world organization via observation and interviews. And of course, Friedman famously said, there's no point talking to anyone because even though they may think they're doing X and Y, they can't be, because in order to be making profits and surviving under competition, they have to do these things which are part of our formal assumptions. And at the same time in psychology, there were articles which said that you couldn't rely on interview material because of work which showed that, that people could be influenced, so to speak, subconsciously about things that they weren't even aware of. So these became ways in which interviewing and observation and those kind of things became not particularly valuable. And instead, there was a more abstract effort to explain organizations essentially as a collection of individual utility functions whose behavior could be theoretically modeled. I don't think it's clear how far Friedman or others recognized at the time just how far, by making optimization the benchmark, that they were departing from the ability to explain real-world decision-making. I think it just was something that everybody got going on, and it wasn't so clear, and still isn't clear, perhaps. A very similar development, interestingly, took place in political science, in which an interpretive framework based on understanding political decision-making within a framework of meaning and culture gave way to a modeling rational choice framework with roots in economics and utility calculation. And Catherine Fieschi, who will be here tomorrow, can talk about that. Meanwhile, research in psychology followed a very similar path, rather surprisingly. Pre-war, there was behaviorism. Before that, there was kind of German romantic, and there was not much difference between psychology and philosophy. Then you got behaviorism, then you got the cognitive revolution in the post-war period, and then you got the cognitive revolution gave way to a limited version of itself in which the mind was conceived to operate like a computer. And of course, this all came from electrical engineering, which was making great strides at the time. That's all detailed by Jerome Bruner. Now, applied to the study of judgment and decision-making, psychology research compared human decision-making with a normative model of decision-making resting on an OCF framework. In the laboratory and in some field experiments, it became clear that human decision-makers, rather than optimizing the data made available to them so that they could make judgments rationally, frequently missed cues or drew on only part of the data, demonstrating what has become known as the representative bias, the affect heuristic, the availability bias, the optimism bias, numerous other biases, and irrational loss aversion. It's an important feature of all these studies that the subjects in the experiments were given the information that you would need to use if you were to use a sensible way of using probability to get what is the best thing to do. So essentially, they're all set up mostly as gambling problems in which you get choices to make. Now, in other words, influenced by the OCF framework, psychology research focused first on prescribing how decision makers should act rationally by maximizing information as if they were in small world conditions, but then concluded they did not. So essentially, you've got this idea that human decision makers are essentially not very good. And there's now a whole branch of psychology trying to think that that can't really make sense because look at the world we're living in and all the things that humans have achieved. So how does this all get squared? A problem is that under the OCF agenda, research can easily become blind to real-world uncertainty. And for example, this is also evident in a much more recent piece of psychology. So this is post-2008, where a group of very respected psychologists are arguing that behavioral strategy research should learn from the success of behavioral economics by focusing on non-rational, that is, non-optimizing behavior. Referring to the challenges how to explain events at Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and BP, the oil rig, as well as failed mergers such as AOL Time Warner and HP Compaq, they suggest the facts overwhelmingly implicate poor executive judgment, or larger macro cultures of poor judgment, and argue matters could be improved by making use of research which specifies how the design of contextual architectures can be nudged to promote sound judgments and better firm performance. So the idea here is that, again, there kind of is a way these executives should have behaved, which you would know at the time. And if you create the architecture of the way they make decisions correctly, then people will make the right decisions. But this obviously is, well, it seems to me obvious, this cannot really work with the kind of decisions we began at the beginning. And nudge, of course, has been quite successfully applied to relatively simple things. So the UK has greatly increased its tax revenue by redesigning the tax form in such a way that people filled it in slightly differently. But this is a situation, and also with the pensions, we have the opt-out rather than the opt-in, which comes from the nudge framework. These are very successful ideas, but they're for situations where it's easy to agree what we're trying to do, and it's fairly easy to see if we're doing better or not. So it goes back to sort of basic experimental operation research type thing, where you can design things well, you can do it, you can make it work. But it's difficult to see how this can work for many other things, which is why John Kay and Mervyn King, in a book that they'll be publishing next year, argue that really this form of research has abdicated from exploring the important questions about decision-making in favor of what they call harvesting the low-lying fruit to be gathered from probabilistic reasoning. So current emphasis also on uncertainty quantification and communication and government guidelines for project assessment, the Green Book, also reflect this framework because they reflect the idea that there's something to be communicated. If people would only get it, they would make better decisions. And this will be true in certain situations, but it's difficult to see how it's true in the ones we're talking about. And because there's no explicit recognition of the limits of these methodologies in the literature, then I think it's quite likely that they will mislead. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time setting this out, and I apologize for those people who already know it, because it seems to be very important to understand how did this shift take place? How did they go from trying to understand the way firms actually operated and governments and so on operated in the real world to the whole business of being able to create these optimal frameworks in which most of the research in the field became concerned with how you could do that. And in psychology, it became the study of bias and error, although as we see, that can be problematic. So the shift accompanied the increasing institutionalization of separate disciplines and sub-disciplines within disciplines. So, it's not just sociology, but medical sociology or this sociology or the other sociology. It's not just maths, it's this sort of maths or this sort of applied statistics or this sort of psychology. So each one has these sub-disciplines, and each with separate definitions of relevant research questions and very often separate journals that you have to go to and so on. So an effect seems to have been both to enable academic research in sub-disciplines to follow disciplinary silo-defined courses and to make addressing less tractable or cross-disciplinary questions, which are hard, such as radical uncertainty, more difficult and less rewarding to address. And a range of factors have underpinned all these developments, so disciplinary boundaries and niches, the elegance of general solutions, the promise of invariant laws, the role of incentives in directing action to mathematically tractable problems and publishable results, the reduction of uncertainty to risk or to ambiguity in economics and strategy research, the reification of evolutionary metaphors in organization study, and the reification of the computer metaphor for the brain and an associated conception of rationality. So I've chosen not to talk about AI, but AI is an issue here, again, because AI is going to do well in some situations, but it's going to be problematic when you come to radical uncertainty. We do not imply that the OCF has been so dominant, of course, that there's been no other work in decision-making, nor other ways to apply formal approaches to it. So, or although the explicit recognition of radical uncertainty is rare, there are, for example, ways to formalize decision-making frameworks that do not require complete knowledge of outcomes, probabilities, and so on. And in some setting, risk analysis is done not to produce answers, but to produce a way of thinking about a problem in a rigorous way, which shows the kind of things that you need to do. The most famous example of this is actually the Arrow-Debreu general equilibrium thesis in economics, where the whole point was to show how general equilibrium was very unlikely to happen, because you need complete markets set up at the year one forever, no change, etc., etc., etc. Then there are too many economists here, so I won't go into it. But this was aimed at demonstrating that the model had a problem. It became, however, for some reason, treated as though the economy is in an equilibrium. And so, as Adair Turner has often argued, this influenced the behavior of regulators who went around, every time anybody produced a new product with a new market, with new complicated derivatives and so on, they thought this is great because it's adding a new market. So that, but I nonetheless think, and wouldn't like it to be thought otherwise, that the use of formal ways of trying to think through problems, that is highly useful, and so I'm going to just talk about for a moment. And there are things happening in management research that Mark will talk about, which is having an uncertainty turn. There's obviously the work of Gigerenzer, of Klein, and so on. And, for example, the Bank of England is attempting to use a heuristic approach to financial regulation, and so on. So there are things happening. Nor is the aim here to discredit mathematical techniques. It's rather to put them in context so that longer term we can focus better on the scope for their use in decision-making process, as you will hear something about in the next session. Because it's quantitative techniques and, are well thought of because they've been successful, right? So if you think of going back to the World War II, one of the earliest examples of operational research was painting airplanes bomber airplanes different colors, and they discovered that you save many lives when you chose the right color. The pilots came back more often. And this became very sophisticated, of course, and that's really the basis of operational research. And they're useful for thinking through all kinds of things like supply chains, optimum pathways, and so on, provided all the time you know what you're doing. So I'm not trying to argue against it, and there are numerous other examples. But notwithstanding their value, a foundation in applied mathematical tools that rely on optimization will be inherently problematic, with constant potential to lead to misleading conclusions when any of the following things apply. So data uncertainty, I won't elaborate, model uncertainty, and most important, what is perhaps best called ontological uncertainty, which actually I think is the best name for radical uncertainty, but it doesn't tend to be popular because people don't seem to quite know what it means. But basically, uncertainty about how we think the world works, and therefore uncertainty about the probability of a big surprise. Now, it occurred to me while I was writing this that in general, if you think of the world as tending towards radical uncertainty or the problem you're trying to look at, then really any optimization technique, by definition, is going to take a variable and then optimize on it, is very likely to give you trouble, because that may not be the thing that actually, there may be multiple conflicting values or things that you need to be thinking about. And here I'd recommend David Stark, who was also a member of our network, who has a concept of dissonance as a general phenomenon. And so he studied the way in which in certain situations there were conflicting goals and values and systems within organizations or firms. And in fact, if bits of the factory were not operating on optimization procedures, then actually when certain difficult things happen, these companies did much better. One of the best examples of this was at the time of 9/11. The company which did much of the electrical stuff for the internet and so on, which of course went down with the bombs, or with the bombs. That particular company, it turned out that the engineers, instead of optimizing the supplies of all this stuff, had quite a bit lying around the city. And they were, as a result, they were able to get the system up and running in a very short time. And when the CEO turned up to see how they were getting on, he came in from Europe, I think. It's Cisco Systems. When the CEO came in, they were all frightened that they're going to be told off for having, so to speak, hoarded bits of equipment rather than kept to the strict rules. But of course, he came in and said, well done, guys. But there are quite a lot of examples of this kind of thing where we've seen supply chains break down, for example, when there were various weather events and it turned out that you were relying on a particular place without quite warehousing, etc. So I think the notion of dissonance is quite a useful one in this particular area. So some or all of the features of radical uncertainty are present in all the decisions that I listed at the beginning. And I'll go through them, and I think I've made the point. But I want to just talk for a moment about misplaced concreteness. So models are the product of imagination. This, if anything, is a key message I want to put. And we've got Richard Bronk at the back who may say some things about it. That models are not, so to speak, the world. They are our way of imagining the world. But the difficulty is that once we've got them written down and expressed and producing results, that sometimes, instead of it being a thoughtful play, it turns into the idea that it is a concrete reality. So there's a Shackle, the economist, is famous for saying, the void of time to come can be filled only by works of the imagination. That is, by what Jens Beckett calls imaginaries or fictional expectations. So this book here, a little bit of publicity, which is, I am an author, but I don't think I get a financial benefit from it, is Richard Bronk and Jens Beckett have done. And I strongly recommend their introduction, which deals with this thing. And one of the points they make is that business plans, discounted cash flow models, and even country credit ratings are attempts to organize and subject to rigorous analysis visions of the future that have their origins in imagined futures, while at the same time helping to create such futures. The systematic structure of models helps to flesh out and construct the imaginaries central to fictional expectation. A perfect example of Hazlitt is a literary critic, if you don't know, reasoning imagination in action. It involves the careful stress testing of imagined futures by rational analysis in the light of such knowledge as we have about emerging patterns and stable, knowable constraints, as a prop to careful judgments about uncertain futures. And it involves the exploration and visualization of different possibilities with the help of systematic tools of analysis. And in the book, there are lots of nice examples of the way this sort of thing happens. So the key point I'm trying to make here is to keep in mind that these models are, so these, they call calculated devices, which is any model or anything else, they exist in the imagination. Now, in contrast, as I said before, to working in that area, we've mostly used the OCF framework. And I just want to finish with some of the ideas that we have about areas of research that could be developed and which there's, so to speak, a gap around. The first point, we think, is the way to help this field to work better is to start with co-creation. So in other words, start with the problems that decision makers actually have and bring academic skill across the disciplines into trying to solve real-world problems, starting with listening to what they actually are. And it seems to me that if we do that, it's pretty inevitable. If we succeed in doing it, first, you'll certainly get impact. But secondly, the challenge of disciplines having to work together to solve problems will almost certainly produce very new and creative thinking. And I'm talking about all the disciplines we're talking, not just the social sciences, but the social sciences, the mathematicians, and so on. Some of this will involve what I call descriptive and documentary research, because this is what's gone missing. We don't have much knowledge of how decision makers actually make decisions. We can learn when people write their, when they retire and they write their story of what they did at the Bank of England or the Cabinet Office or whatever, some accounts of these things, but we're not actually studying them, and this, I think, is very important, and some of the work you'll hear today and tomorrow will deal with that. It's also likely, I think, that future work will need mostly to involve field experiments. So you can introduce changes, and we'll hear this afternoon an effort that we did in collaboration with the START project, some of my colleagues there, which is a kind of form of experimental work of trying to help them with a particular set of decision-making problems that they have. But we think there might be 10 prime research questions. It should be a cross-disciplinary agenda. And these are the kind of things that seem to be missing. So there's a lot of talk about narratives these days, and that narratives influence decision-making, and Mr. Trump is doing it all the time. And you kind of see that there are ideas here that we have not understood and have not developed enough time to think about. Emotion is clearly an area which is important, because traditionally emotion is seen as getting in the way of rational decision-making, whereas in fact we know now from neuroscience is absolutely not the case. Of course it can get in the way, but emotion and cognition are going together very closely. Then there's the question of quantification and communication in real-world practice. So how can mathematical expertise contribute to decision-making under radical uncertainty? And can we create a code of practice to help avoid the unthinking application of the OCF, which nobody wants, and better bring the benefits of quantification and mathematical framing into real-world decision-making? I think there's a huge potential area, and the next talk will deal with it to some extent. There's a question of expertise that I've already mentioned, and above all, there is being interested in mistakes, because the kind of side effect of optimal choice is that you don't think that things are inevitably going to go wrong, right? Whereas in radical uncertainty, it's inevitable that even if you do sensible things, things will not turn out. So the study of mistakes may well be one of the most profitable areas. Now, there are some famous studies like investigation of the Challenger accident and things, but those tend to be these big inquiries, and this is not kind of, I think, become a sufficiently central kind of issue to look at. Things like what happened to seeing Phil up there. How did the BP thing go wrong, you see? And there's a lot of anxiety about even looking at whether we had mistakes, and yet if we live in a world of radical uncertainty at all, learning how mistakes happen is probably the most important thing we can do.
Is it clear what a mistake is? I mean, a very risky decision that went right might still have been a mistake.
Yeah, so it's not, I think you're raising the many issues that need to be looked at. Yeah. I'm just going to stop and then you can make that point again. Adaptive heuristics and simple rules. So in fact, there's a great, what business people do is they use simple rules adapted to their particular environment. But do they actually, and we know that's quite a good approach in general. But there's nonetheless the whole point about an adaptive rule is why have you chosen it? And so looking further at how that actually works and where it can go wrong. Conviction narratives, that is, how do you overcome, what are the processes, if you're in uncertainty and you may make a loss, what are the processes that allow you to put loss out of mind and to do things, and under what circumstances can that go wrong? There's the question of resilience and the ways in which you can include diversity and debate. There are definitely issues to do with leadership, group processes and so on, which are completely understudied. And then there's also the question of role play and experience-based anticipation. So although there's quite a lot of foresight exercises and so on, in fact, this is a whole area where we don't know very much. So, concluding, surveying the landscape of research into real-world decision-making under uncertainty leads us to the conclusion that there's a significant gap in knowledge, and specifically that the over-preoccupation with the, that's wrong, anyway, with the rational choice framework has sidelined some very important questions about decision processes in the real world. And we need to know how can we better understand and better organize decision-making under radical uncertainty. So we're going to propose that the UKRI actually fund something to make this a priority area and to try to reverse this gap. And we think, for a variety of reasons, it could be quite innovative and make a big contribution, because there's not much going on like this in the UK, but also in the rest of the world. And there are reasons for thinking that in the US, for example, they may take much longer to get round to this because of the particular way that their system works, but maybe not. Of course, one of the key problems here is it's proved quite difficult, and we found that with the pilot projects, that there isn't an easy career path for people who want to work interdisciplinary. So this also, we're proposing that the UKRI take a real look, and there's a lot of talk about this problem, but so one of the functions of this particular institute, if they were to set it up, was that it really they should be engaged, and other organizations should be engaged to trying to make sure that there are ways in which people can come into this and where they're going to go afterwards, and what journals they're going to publish, and so on. Because the present situation is not producing good results. Okay, I shall stop there and hand over to Lenny. Thank you very much.
And now we have my colleague from LSE, Lenny Smith.
Great. So now I think we're going to do what David and I do best, and amazingly best, which is I'm basically going to say the same thing, and it's going to sound completely different. So those of you who understood that talk completely and every word, you can probably ignore me or try to. And those of you who got a little confused at pieces, especially the applied mathematicians and the scientists, then what I say now may make a little more sense. The first thing I want to do is come back to these issues that David mentioned. But we really have two different kinds of decisions that we're talking about. Weather-like decisions, like Knightian risk, decisions that you make over and over, always slightly different, but sort of the same, carrying an umbrella, whatever you like. And climate-like tasks. And I'm going to talk a lot about models, because models are used in support of these decisions. In weather-like tasks, the models, you make hundreds or thousands of forecasts to inform your decision with the same model. In climate-like forecasts, they're sort of one-off decisions, or the situation will have changed drastically, or your options will have changed. And it turns out in climate-like forecasts, usually the time scale of the phenomena is longer than the lifetime of the model. And that gives a very different aspect to whether or not you can learn from your mistakes. There's a sense in which you simply cannot, right? And this certainly contributes to radical uncertainty. And then I would, this is still too long for an aim, but really, I think what we're trying to do is get to a decision process where whatever the outcome on the first trial, like you say, you may have done the wrong thing, right? Whatever that outcome is, you're happy with that process so much that you would use it again the next time in the same situation. And you would probably do the same thing in the same situation, unless you had learned something, the probability of a big surprise, unless you had really learned there was something fundamentally wrong with your way of looking at the problem or with your way of modeling the problem. And then, of course, everything changes, and the Bayesians get sort of lost. Okay? Now, to summarize David's talk, I would just call a lot of what mathematicians do the shambles of the whole shebang. It's just super tempting to build a model of everything. You can get paid a lot for building a model of everything, and then paid even more to build a bigger computer to run it on, right? So you tend to do things like you include model variables that have the same names as observables, like temperature or interest rate. And then you can run simulation or ensemble simulations forward in time, and you pretend that the simulations that you're running forward in time reflect reality in some very precise way. And except for the integers, I would argue they never do, ever. You have this interpretation step where you have to come out of model land and go back into the real world. Well, you don't have to, and I think one of the problems we run into is that many people don't. Right? You explain what the model said to the practitioner and you walk away. Right? And this lack of sort of an end-to-end approach is really missing in many of the studies we've looked at, of the decisions we've looked at, often because it's simply not incentivized for academics or even professional modelers, and certainly not for consultants, to do that. Okay. So, this is a proven recipe for disaster. It's not small models, it's not large models, it's just the confusion. It's this what Whitehead called this misplaced concreteness. We begin to look too heavily into our models, and it's true we can't simulate the pieces independently. This is the most common response I get. We have to build a big model. We can't do the little pieces independently. Well, it's true you can't do them independently, but this doesn't imply you can do the whole shebang. Sometimes we need to accept that, and at least we need to accept how we interpret it. Never believe a salesperson claiming that the best available model has to be adequate for your purpose. Right? The question for us is adequacy for purpose, not having the biggest computer or the most realistic model. The question is, does it actually address usefully the questions you're asking? So this is model land. But there's much too much detail here to talk about in the time remaining. But you sort of come in here, and there's a really quick choice. You either run into this amusement park of optimal solutions, never to be seen again, you have a lot of fun, you retire, you write lots of books, or you sort of weave down this confederation of exact sciences. I mean this to be extremely broad. And then things can be really interesting and much more useful. You know, many people, including myself, get drawn down to this kingdom of the physical sciences. But then you have a choice. If you aren't careful, you know, you fall down here to the desert of precise physical laws. We may not get there. I may not get there with you, right? But one day, physics will, and then you end up getting close to this cliff of faith and convergence, and you fall into the sea of self-delusion, right? We got lots of people down here, right? Or, you know, you sort of move around and you realize about shadowing, and you get mathematical consistency turns out to be important. You become a Bayesian. At least visit the Bayesian quarter. Now this is great. You can learn a lot in the Bayesian quarter, especially insights to how to actually clearly formulate the problem. But very often you can't solve the problem mathematically once you formulated it, unless you do things like change the definition of probability from what physicists mean, which is as empirically well-based as mass and charm and strangeness, to something which is just subjective. You go off the cliff of subjectivity, boom, you're back here in the sea of self-delusion, right? These were really discussed, not quite in these words, but very similar ideas were discussed in the 50s, and people went running back up to try and find things that are relevant. If you get through here, you might get interested in the mass. A lot of people get sucked into the computation and have a great deal of time. If you aren't careful in physics, you fall into the bottomless lake of the perfect model, where again, you believe that there's a perfect model out there, and you're getting closer to it, and so you can actually do things to get the information you need, but you can't get back out. On the other hand, this is the exit. There's a little notch here for the integers. If you're doing maths on the integers, it seems to really work so far. But we can get quantitative insight, we can get plausible pathways, we can formulate the problem extremely well using the Bayesian structure, and we can actually learn the streets of simulation. So I'm not going to have time to walk through the different things I'm going to show you, but you can find, you know, without meaning to, I mean, after we made up the cartoon, I could actually find, oh yeah, that's where the reindeer went, and oh yeah, that's where the jellyfish shutting down nuclear power plants went. Oh, and after all, that's just a model. That's not real. So, you know, another mathematician wrote this, right? There's no use trying, one can't believe impossible things. And the Queen replies, I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did. I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've even believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Now, I always sort of like this, But in a summer school in the Alps, I was teaching with an old friend and postdoc, Joost, and he'd been working on one of the world's best, almost for sure, best climate model. And he came down one morning and said, "Ha, that's 3 bugs before breakfast." Right? Looking at this extremely large, important piece of code, he'd literally found 3 non-trivial mistakes. I mean, these are not little things. These are just wrong physics in this climate model before breakfast, which is pretty close to 6. So I think we just have to accept, well, we have a choice. Many modelers accept this is the world they are in, and they are not using the models to try to get out the sort of detailed, it would be easy to make a decision if I had all this information. Instead, you use the models to actually gain insight about the problem and the decision you're making. So these are some of the things that we've looked at over a long period of time. Jellyfish really do shut down nuclear power plants when they clog up the water intakes. This is how many hunting licenses should you issue for reindeer in Norway. Ed, who's over here, worked with the Royal National Lifeboat Institute about how much training should you do? How do you minimize accidents? Because if you train, lots of accidents happen when you're training, but if you don't train and then it happens in rough seas. So they're interesting questions. The point is these are all very on-the-ground questions. Nuclear stewardship, how do you actually do experiments when you haven't been able to set up a bomb for a long time? Climate, the climate community recognizes that there's structural model error and that there are limitations, that puts limitations, but they don't really know what to do next. It tends to fall back into large numbers of things with one global disclaimer on page 797. Weather forecasting, issues of getting information into model land, and issues of communication. This is what these numbers mean. This is from earlier this year about hurricanes and hurricane forecasting. So the idea is, for us, not stopping, getting out of model land, not even stopping there, but trying to actually get involved, as David said, co-creation with the people who are making the decisions. And you'll hear more about that from our START colleagues in just a while. So what have we learned? Well, model land allows for this sort of false sense of superiority and confidence, and you really are, you know what you're doing until it doesn't work. So the question is, how do we get a sense of how that's going to happen? If we let go of what David calls fantastic objects, well, I think these are fantastic mathematical objects, and the achievables, so you could do lots of stuff in model land, but it doesn't carry over. You can publish lots of papers on the stuff you did in model land, and as long as nobody uses it, then that's good carbon sequestration. We really want to try to move to more relevant information for the real world and better outcomes that actually support real decisions. And then the point is valuable alternatives actually exist. Right? We can often get them with our models today. We just can't get the whole shebang. The choice isn't model land or nothing. Right? The choice is actually interpreting the models in ways that are useful, if there is a way to do that, for the people making the decision. But the problem is that nothing is ever going to look as good as a perpetual motion machine. Someone from model land comes in and says, oh, but I can give you this probability and that outcome and this, nothing ever looks that good. It just doesn't work. Right? And that's a huge uphill battle for individuals and everybody. So, if you're worried, you might be living in model land if you're trying to optimize anything regarding the future. This idea of optimizing is right out. Right? If you believe that decision-relevant probabilities could easily be extracted, or maybe extracted at all. If you believe they're precise parameter values and you just have to find them, or a particular way to formulate some aspect of your model. If you refuse to believe in anything that's not been seen in the model, like it doesn't exist. By the way, all of these statements have been made to me by deeply faithful modelers, even that one. Or that if you learn more about the problem, it's going to reduce the uncertainty. It may well increase the uncertainty. It actually, in my experience, increases it more than it decreases it, because you realize there are other things that are important. If you actually set the probability of a big surprise to 0, because there's nothing your model can't do. I've heard this statement in the sales pitch, right, to the Met Office. And if you really want to have one model to rule them all, there's sometimes a push just to build one big model and it'll do everything. The diversity of models helps us see the weaknesses in each of our models. And having a diversity of models is of extreme value. And you can actually trace these around too, but we won't. So critical decisions. I'm actually going to stop the critical decisions. I'm really happy to come back and think about these later. But You know, the real sorts of questions we need to ask are, is the best available model adequate for your purpose, your question? And maybe they can only build one. Maybe there are lots of reasons why today, for your question, the model simply isn't relevant. We're working with START, we managed to show that for heat waves, and in certain regions of the world, the models are relevant. There are places where the models have skill and tell us stuff. There are other places where it doesn't, and what we need to do is to get them off the table. Right? The idea of having one model that will tell you everything, and that the best available model has to be adequate for purpose, is extraordinarily misleading. Next, you may be hoping to get out of model land. Here are some hints to tell you whether or not you're near the exit. So if now, even just now, you're concerned your forecast system's probability of a big surprise may be a bit too high to make it useful, then that's good, right? It's uncomfortable, but that's a good sign. If you're uncomfortable to realize that if you had 100 times the resources and you went out to your team about how do we use our model to do these wonderful new things, they come back and say, oh, we should build a better model. Right? That basically means the probabilities under your current model are still in model land. You need to be careful to distinguish X from its model land namesake, X model. Right? If you're worrying about this, how do I interpret my outputs back into the world? That's a good thing. If you've forsaken the quest for a model that tells you everything, to search for models that might at least tell you something that's of interest to you, that's a huge step forward, and probably it's a transition I think most of my students and postdocs go through if they haven't already. And if you're sort of intrigued by the idea that finding your model's relevant, dominant uncertainty, you know, the aspect of your model that you should improve the most. I mean, very often we take a very physics-based or sector-based way of improving our models because we know what is wrong, as opposed to looking at the data and letting our models tell us what it can't do that actually happens in terms of the particular quantity we're interested in. And I'd like more of these. Right? We'll have some time for discussion. We've got 2 days with lots of discussion. So these sorts of questions about, well, I talked to the modeler and they said, but I thought, but they said, but I thought, and then it didn't work, right? Or then it did work. And it can go either way. But more examples of how to tell if you're nearing the exit. And there I'll stop. I think the main issue, we'd really like to collect your thoughts. There are lots of problems. There are interesting ways of collecting thoughts. These are forecasts for Hurricane Irma, which had it all going way over here. This is my brother's car, which was way over here. Right? This question about how you actually give people information. Physics is almost always incomplete. This is the planet Vulcan, which existed for about 50 years until general relativity taught people they didn't need to find it anymore. And how can we actually embrace the fact that this is all that's out there, that we can't get a perpetual motion machine? Thank you very much.